Okay, so now we are ready to tack our binding down using our invisible thread. I have to tell you that the best and the worst thing about invisible thread is it is invisible. So I want to show you a few tips on how to have good success using invisible thread. Because it's such a fine thread, one of the first things you want to do on your sewing machine is dial your tension down. So your top tension. If your regular tension is a 4, then I would dial that down to a 3. The other thing we're going to do when we do our stitch in the ditch is we are going to lengthen the stitch length. So if your regular stitch length is a 2.5, I would go up to a 3.5. Now remember at the beginning we talked about the stitch in the ditch foot. That's the foot that has that guide coming right down the center. That's the foot that I have on the machine right now. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that that guide is going right between the piping and your binding. And so we're going to lower that presser foot, and we've got our stitch length up a little longer, and we are going to go right down between, see how we're going right between the piping and the binding. Now see how that guide, it just kind of separates, makes the little pathway for the needle to go right in between those two. So you can just use just your regular piecing needle, doesn't have to be a special needle. That extra stitch length, that little extra long stitch length, again, is going to make this just a little bit easier to feed through the whole machine. All right, wasn't that easy? A lot easier than we think. All right, and so now that binding is all tacked down, and I want to show you the other side. So see how nice that looks? Now typically I would match the thread in the bobbin to the binding, but you can see that that is going right along the edge there, and see how nice that looks. All right, so now we're ready to, I'm going to change my sewing, my presser foot again so that we can sew the binding on the rest of the quilt. Okay, I finished changing my thread and my presser foot on the sewing machine, and I decided where I want to sew the sections for my pockets. This is a really easy process. You can mark if you would like to. You're just going to make sure you do a back stitch right across your binding right here, and you're just going to sew a seam. Now I did pretty even pockets, but maybe your candy bar is bigger than my candy bar, so you might want a bigger pocket on yours. So you decide wherever you want to sew these down. The other thing I did was to just tack the edges of the pocket down. So now we're going to treat this just like we would your quilt. When you have your quilt all finished and you're ready to sew the binding on, the first thing that I do is I want to make sure that I have nice 90-degree angles on each corner of my quilt. So the easiest way to do that on this, I'm going to just bring the rotary cutter over with a ruler, and you want to be really careful at this point. I don't want to chop a bunch of my quilt off. This really comes down to just a few threads. I'm going to line this up, and I am going to shave off just literally a few threads, and that's going to make a difference. I'm going to turn this around. I'm going to do the other corner. If I line the ruler up along the bottom of the quilt here, and then along the side here, I can really see clearly if this is a nice 90-degree angle. Just kind of clean that. Less is definitely more at this point. Okay, and then I'm going to do this side right here. And I'm going to line this up with the ruler, this up with the edge of the quilt. It doesn't even look like I need to cut any off, but just for good measure, we're going to just clean up that corner, slide this down. Right now, you can have full confidence that these corners are going to miter really nicely. Okay, now it's time for our binding. Now we have our binding is all made. When you are going to sew the binding on the edge of the quilt, you want to pick a nice open spot. So for me, that's usually somewhere along a nice long straight edge. So on this mat, the most obvious place would be up here on this section. I like to leave a nice at least 8-inch tail when I start to sew a binding. Now I don't normally start this close to a corner, but if this is how long my quilt is, then I'm going to start this close to the corner. So we're going to bring this over to the sewing machine. On this, we don't have any piping on the edge of the quilt, so we're going to have the binding on the top of the quilt. I have my 1/4 inch piecing foot snapped on. I have made sure that my tension is back at the normal, which is 4.0 for my machine, and then your stitch length is going to be your normal stitch length, so probably around a 2.5. We're going to start sewing. Now this, let me get this binding over here. All right. This same rule applies where I want to see just a sliver of my quilt showing underneath. Again, I don't want the binding to slide over and lose some of that seam allowance. And so I have the edge of the quilt along the edge of that presser foot. Now when I get about to this point, I'm going to stop with that needle in down position. I'm going to sneak over here and grab my little handy dandy ruler and my marking pen. And this little ruler just has a little mark that's letting me know that I am a quarter of an inch away from the edge of the quilt is. So I'm marking a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the quilt. It's easiest if I do it at this point. If I try to mark it before I sew it on the quilt, I'll usually mark it in the wrong place. And then if you would like to, when you get to that point, you can do a little back stitching. Then I'm going to take this out of the machine. And now this is where we're going to miter the corner. Now, a lot of times it seems easy to put your quilt in your lap and miter the corner in your lap. But have you ever had a corner of your quilt where that miter is just a little bit extra long, or it's kind of a little bit scrunched in? If you take the time to take it out of the quilt, out of the sewing machine, and I like to line the edge of my quilt up on my cutting mat right along one of the lines, and then I bring my binding up like this. Now do you see what I'm doing? I am lining up the edge of my quilt and the edge of my binding, so you know this is going to be a perfect 45-degree angle. Now, most quilt instructions are going to say we're going to bring this binding back down, and they're going to say to have this fold be along the top of the quilt. But what I want to do is I bring that down just a couple of threads. I bring that fold just a couple of threads below the top of the quilt. The other thing that we want to make sure of is that these two folded edges are right next to each other. So we're going to check along the top. We're going to check that these two are next together and that our raw edges are along the edge of the quilt. And then you can put a pin here if you would like, or you can just secure that by holding onto it. We're going to bring that back to the sewing machine. And we're going to start right at the top. And again, we're going to have just a little whisper of that quilt showing. And then off we go. So I'm going to continue to go around the edge of our sewing mat, mitering the corners. And then I'm going to show you how we're going to close up those ends. Okay, this is my last corner. I've sewn around the whole mat. Now as I come around, I want to make sure that I'm going to be leaving a nice 8 to 10 inch opening to close up my two ends of binding. And I like to do just a little back stitching right here. And then we're going to cut this. All right, so now I've got plenty of binding here, so I'm going to just snip off a little bit here, so just so we don't have such a nice long tail. And now at this point, we're going to come over to the ironing board. Okay, now we have our two ends, and we're going to connect them. So again, There are several different techniques for closing up the ends of your binding. This just happens to be my favorite. This is the one that I like to use. So I bring the one side over about to that middle point of my opening, and I fold that back, and I just give that a little press of the iron just so we can have a nice mark there. And I bring the other side around, and then what I'm going to do is fold this side back, and I am leaving a nice 1/4 of an inch opening. Now this is true whether I am doing a bias binding or a straight grain binding. We just need that little space so that when we sew them together, this is going to lay flat. So I'm going to give that a little press. We want to be able to see. And then what we're going to do, I'm going to move back over here to the mat so I can spread this out a little bit more. And what we're going to do is we are going to open this up. Now I'm going to take my marking pen and I'm going to draw a line where the fold line is. This is where we folded this one back. Now if you can see it when you are doing yours at home, you don't need to draw this line. This is just to help you to see this better. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to fold. We need to fold the quilt in because this is not long enough to do the next part. So you fold the quilt in, and actually for good measure I like to just bring a pin and fold and pin these two together. That way I'm not trying to manage because maybe this is a big quilt we're working with. So I just pull those out together. Now I'm going to open up this side, and I'm going to, let me back up just a hair. I want to make sure we have a little bit more room here. So I'm going to unpick just an inch or so. There we go. So now we're going to fold this quilt. No sense struggling with the quilt. I'm going to pin this together. All right. So now this side, we have opened up that seam and we've marked the fold. Now I'm going to open up this one, and we're going to lay these two at a right angle. Now I'm going to mark, this is the fold on the right side. And we're going to lay these two at a right angle. So the right side, the raw edge is going to be up against the fold line on this side, and then the fold line on my right side is going to be along the top edge. Now what I always do at this point is I always put a pin where I'm supposed to sew. And so we are going to sew this together just like we sewed our binding strips together. We're going to be sewing from valley to valley. But this is one reason why I like this technique, because it gives me a chance to double check myself before I sew and I cut. So I put a pin where I am supposed to sew, and then I open this up and I see if this is laying flat. And yes, my binding is not twisted, so I know that these are in the right place. So then you're going to just open this back up. And then I like to, I'm going to get my little straight edge. Let me back this up just a little bit so you can see that. There we go. I like to get my little straight edge. I'm going to take my pin out, and I'm going to put that right on the sew line, and let's go ahead and mark that with our pen. Having that marked is going to make it much easier for you. And then we're going to put a pin across here. All right, so what we have is the two ends of the binding. So there we go. We've got this two ends of the binding are at a right angle to each other. We have marked and pinned where we're going to sew. So now let's head back to the sewing machine. Now the same thing applies as when we were sewing our binding strips together. I'm going to dial down my stitch length so it's a little bit tighter stitch. And then I'm going to make sure my quilt is out of the way. This should be nice and flat. And we are going to just sew right along that sew line. Take that pin out. Right from valley to valley. We're not going to have to back stitch. Okay, let's take it out, come back to here. Now, again, I will double check this before I go ahead and cut. Then I go ahead and I lay this flat. Even though we have this excess, I can see that I have sewn this in the right place. So now we come and we're going to, I just come up to here, and again, not a scant 1/4 inch. I do a nice, probably a 3/8 to a 1/2 inch, trimming off that dog ear. And then again, this seam is going to be pressed open. You can do a nice little finger press. If you have starched your fabric when you made your binding, this will lay pretty nice and flat just with a good finger press. Then we're going to close this back up. See how nice that lays, nice and flat. It's not pulled extra tight. So now we go back to the sewing machine with our 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to bring this back up to my regular stitch length, and then we're going to sew all the way down. Again, leaving a nice little whisper of quilt showing as we complete sewing this binding all the way around our quilt, going back over that original stitching just a little ways. Okay, so now the binding is sewn all the way around the outside of the quilt. And so the next process, back to the ironing board. This is why it's nice having an ironing board that is close to where we're working. Now you're going to repeat the same process that you did when we sewed the binding on the top of the pocket. The first thing that I like to do is I come to the back of the quilt and I just kind of press that edge of the quilt flat. I'm just going to do this corner to show you. Now I'm going to press the binding away from the quilt. Again, remembering that this is a bias binding. I don't want to stretch out. I just want to push that binding away from the edge of the quilt. Like that. The other thing that I want to make sure of is I want to make sure that on the front of the quilt I don't get a little fold right in here. That's one of the reasons we're pressing this away. We want this to be nice and flat and away. I do like to work the point of the iron just right over the top of that little miter, and that I'll show you that a little closer when we turn this binding around. So that's all nice and flat. So now, when we bring this around to the other side, I like to just kind of poke that quilt down in to that corner, not stretching it out, but just give that a nice little poke into that corner. And then we're going to heat this binding in place just like we did over the top of the pocket. So I'm going to use the washable school glue stick. I like to start just on a corner, and I'm going to come up and I am going to machine sew this binding down. So I want the binding to go 1/8 of an inch past my stitching. And so I'm going to press or hold that over and then heat set this down. And so depending on how wet your glue stick is going to depend on kind of how long you need to heat set that down. Now the other thing I want you to notice is when I fold this over, do you see how we get this nice point right here? Our binding, as we go around that corner, this should come out to this nice point right here. And now we're going to do the next little section, and right here. So this, I keep a little container of baby wipes around at this point because your hands are kind of getting in here with the glue. And so I have some glue on this side, and now I'm going to make sure that that miter is coming down nice and even. So do you see how that seam is folded? I've got that nice 45-degree angle. These edges of the binding are meeting together right here, and we're going to heat set that down. So you're going to continue on around the whole outside of your quilt, just like this. And then we're going to change the thread on our sewing machine back to invisible thread with our stitch in the ditch foot, and we're going to secure that binding down, and then we're going to be finished.